what is the nature of evil, and how can it be reconciled with the idea of God? This is a philosophical question that philosophers have talked about for a long time, and it's kind of relevant to me as a fantasy writer because I write about good and evil in fantasy settings a lot, and so this is something I think about a lot. What exactly is evil? Can we explain it? And does it actually even make sense, this concept that we have? Now, when people talk about evil and God and how those two concepts interact with each other, something that's brought up a lot is something called the Epicurean Trilemma, which is a framework, an argument that is attributed to Epicurus, the Greek philosopher, and which he may not have ever actually said, but modern atheists attribute it to him and use this argument a lot. And it goes like this. So it's a trilemma. So he gives us three options. He says, first, noting that there's evil in the world, and then asking about how that influences whether or not we should believe in God. He says, if God is willing to do away with evil, but he is unable, then he's weak, and therefore should not be called God. If God is able to do away with evil, but he is unwilling, then he's wicked and should not be called God. If God is both able and willing to do away with evil, then how does evil exist? Or conversely, another way to word that third point would be, if God is neither able nor willing, then again, how can he be called God in any sense, right? So basically, since we know that evil exists, and since we know that evil is antithetical to any meaningful definition of God, then it follows that God cannot exist. That's the argument. That's the Epicurean trilemma. Here's the problem that I see with it. It assumes two things. It assumes a certain definition of God, which I don't have such a problem with because most people have kind of a generally common definition of God. I don't think that's so much a problem. But the problem is it assumes that evil is a real thing that can be demonstrated to exist. And people may hear me say that and say, well, how's that a problem? Like, it's obvious that evil exists. But if you look at it a little more, it becomes a little more, it's not that simple, okay? So if we're going to say that evil exists, how would we define evil? How can you, what standard measurement, what standard can you use to determine whether or not something is evil, whether or not evil exists? And I've seen a number of different ways people try to approach this. First, there's the idea of naturalistic evil. This idea that whatever harms humanity's ability to survive as a species is evil. And then whatever helps us to survive as a species is good. But there are all kinds of problems with that. First it assumes that there's some sort of supernal objective value to humanity itself, which we have not shown. Also, this means that we can harm any number of other things that are not humanity, and that's okay as long as we're ensuring humanity's survival. And there's just too many problems with that aspect. I don't think that we can define evil based on that. And in reality, there are many things that the very atheists who make this argument do in their lives that actually could be said to have to be defined as naturalistic evil according to that sense of evil, but they wouldn't recognize it as evil. So yeah, I don't think that is an objective enough standard for evil to be able to make this argument, right? Then we have personal evil. You could say like, well, whatever I view as evil is evil. Whatever goes against my idea of purpose, whatever purpose I have created for myself or for the people around me. Anything that goes against that is evil. But of course, that's the problem with that is it's completely subjective, and it's going to be at odds with other people's definitions of evil, and you can't say that your definition is intrinsically better than anyone else's. So that doesn't really work either. It's just completely subjective. Then we have social evil. We can say, well, evil as defined by society. We can say, well, people can just kind of, we have cultures, we have societies, we have nations. Whatever we collectively decide is evil, well, then that is evil. And of course, whatever we collectively decide is good, that is good. But of course, the problem with that is that's actually a basic fallacy called the ad populum fallacy, argumentum ad populum, where you're just saying that something must be good or evil based on appealing to the population. If a lot of people say something, then it must be true. But that's a fallacy. It doesn't make any sense, and it's also kind of the same fallacy that we see in the other two, in naturalistic evil and personal evil, just kind of on a just kind of manifested in a different way. So I don't think that works either. Because the people who would advocate that interpretation of evil, that definition of evil, they don't really believe in it because you'll see those same people standing against common moral conceptions, common moral beliefs, and saying that society is wrong and that they are right, even though they are in the minority. They are arguing for a minority position. According to this definition of evil, they would always be wrong because society in general is against them, and that is how we define evil, based on how many people vote a certain way, how many people agree with you, right? So it's contradiction. They don't, and most of the people who would make that argument, who would define evil in that way, don't even really believe that. And so the fourth option we have is, I would call it implicit evil. A lot of people would say, like, well, evil just exists, and we all know it. We can all tell. We can't present evidence of it, and we may not even be able to clearly define it all the time based on a standard that we can explain. But we all experience it. It's there. Everyone knows, right? But the problem with that is that in exactly the same way, we can say, well, everyone knows that God exists. It doesn't work. That's not really an argument, right? So this leads me to say that for anyone who would make the argument of the Epicurean Trilemma, to use the existence of evil to argue against the existence of God, I would say that there's actually a more fundamental trilemma that they need to deal with before they can even make that argument, and that is the trilemma of defining evil. So again, this is a trilemma. So that we're given three options here. Our first option is to say that evil is imaginary. It's just a construct, a social construct, a personal construct, something we've just made up. But in that case, what you're essentially doing is you're saying, oh, we know that God is imaginary because the existence of God would be antithetical to the existence of this other thing that I have just admitted is also imaginary. So your imaginary thing can't exist at the same time as my imaginary thing, therefore your thing is imaginary, but my thing is imaginary too. It doesn't make any sense, right? So that's the first option. Evil is imaginary. Of course, and if we just admit evil is imaginary, then what are we even talking about? How is this even an argument? Second, evil as we see it is actually good. We just don't understand how that is the case. And this is actually an argument that a lot of people make. They may not use those words exactly, but I've seen religious people use this argument a number of times. Like when I was in Taiwan, I read a little book. It was made for children, so it was put in simple language, but it was a Buddhist book, and it was giving answers on some like hard questions for life, right? And one of the questions was like, why is it that some people die in terrible plane crashes and terrible fires and things like that? Why does that happen? And the answer was that was karma. The answer was to say that those people had done things such as boil lobsters alive, maybe in this life or maybe in a previous life. And because they had done that, they were experiencing the karmic reaction to that. And so what the Buddhist explanation was saying was that suffering that we perceive as evil was actually good, because it was all part of this great order. It all makes sense. Those people actually deserved that because of what they had done in the past. So the universe makes sense. It all balances. Yes, it looks terrible when you don't understand it, but when you understand it, you see that everything is good, everything is right. It all makes sense. And I've seen Christians say similar things, specifically Calvinists. Their explanation is a little more horrific, I think. Like I've had Calvinists tell me, God will send people to hell because he wants to, because that pleases him. And I asked a Calvinist once, so what happens to people who never even, if you say that people have to believe in Jesus Christ in order to be saved, what about all the people, millions, billions of people who never even had that opportunity? And his response was to say, well, God put them in that situation such that they would never hear of Christ and would go to hell because that pleases God. And God is the standard of all things. Whatever God likes is good, and that's the standard. We may not like it, but so what? We're not God. And that was his approach, and I find that horrific. But it kind of does the same thing. It says that your concept of evil is not actually evil. You just don't understand how it makes sense. If you understood how it makes sense, you wouldn't see it as evil. So that's the second part of this trilemma. The first part is evil is imaginary. Second part, evil is actually good. Third part of this trilemma is all things will be made right in the end. The evil that we perceive is not an eternal reality. All the things that seem wrong to us would be wrong if they were to remain that way forever. But they won't. All things will be made right in the end in some way. And of course, this leads to all kinds of religious beliefs that I'm not going to get into. But that's the trilemma. That's the trilemma to explain the existence of evil. Either evil is imaginary, in which case the whole Epicurean trilemma doesn't make any sense because you're talking about something that's imaginary. Or evil is actually good, in which case, again, the Epicurean trilemma doesn't make any sense because you're talking about something that's actually good. And so how does that contradict the existence of God? Because it's actually good and it's right and it's the way things should be. Or all things that we see as wrong, as bad, as evil, will be made right in the end. There will be restitution, there will be balance, wholeness will come in some way that we may not now understand. It has to be one of those three things, right? And none of those three things work with the Epicurean trilemma, because the framework of the Epicurean trilemma assumes that evil, this thing called evil, exists, that it is real, that there is something fundamentally wrong with the universe. But that idea does not just contradict the existence of God, it also contradicts the existence of a universal order, of a universe of balanced equations, a universe that makes sense. When you say that evil exists in this way, you're saying that the universe does not make sense. And that is actually a very anti-scientific way of looking at the universe. Tell me your thoughts.